Tom, thank you for talking to us.
Cheers, William.
Can you please tell us where the idea for Glad to be Gay came from?
Glad to be Gay was a slogan in the mid-70s London kind of LGBT scenes, and it was a little yellow badge that predated the song, which you used to see people wearing at gay discos and things, in the old sense of gay, which was every letter of LGBTQI, all inclusive. And at the time there was quite heavy oppression by the London police. The Metropolitan Police were hauling into all kinds of minority groups. So black people were getting picked up on suspicion of anything, and the sus laws, which allowed the police to arrest you on suspicion of pretty much anything, were being applied against gay men as well, particularly because they could get soft arrests by going in and busting gay clubs and pubs, because the victims of the arrest weren't likely to contest it because they didn't want publicity at that time. So I guess the song Glad to be Gay was a sarcastic retort, saying, you know, sing if you're glad to be gay, if that's even fucking possible. Which was really what the verses were setting out to do, was detail the reasons why you might not be. But funnily enough, once it came out as a single and was released by EMI Records and got into the charts, and I think it was on an EP that got to number 18 in the chart, which was great.
Was that Rising Free?
Yeah. And once it had been a hit record, people started to regard it, despite the sarcasm, as a celebratory song. And in the way that, say, you know, Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA became seen as a tub-thumping celebration song rather than talking about America's role in Vietnam. And that was okay too. I mean, of course, you wanted something you could rally behind and offer to people as a chance, something that they could sing along. Not everybody liked it, I have to say, at the time.
The BBC Radio 1?
BBC Radio 1 didn't like it. Well, there was a woman called Doreen Davies who had a sticker put on it in the BBC library that said it was not to be played. And she kept stickers on my tunes for the next 5 or 6 years. So nothing of mine got playlisted on Radio 1 for a fair while after that.
John Peel championed it, didn't he?
John Peel ignored the sticker and played it anyway. Bless him. So I think he said that this is Tom's most trenchant offering to date. So that was good. But even within the queer community, there were people who were saying, "Oh, for God's sake, don't put out that awful bloody football chant song." You know, it's so. It's only kind of in retrospect that it's kind of held its own and come to be seen as something that people remember and that has been significant for people. And I'm just so proud, because at the time it looked like commercial suicide, and it certainly affected record sales adversely in terms of what EMI Records could do. But at the same time, if it made a difference to some people's lives, and if it helped soundtrack the struggle, you know, just through the accident of having got into the top 20, then that was a good thing. And I'm so proud, really, all these years later. I think more proud of that than of a couple of records that actually were bona fide top 10 singles.
You originally wrote it in 1976 for the Gay Pride March in London, and then you released it on the EP Rising Free in 1978. Why was there a 2-year gap?
I didn't have a record deal at the time I wrote it.
Ah.
And in between times along came punk rock. Certainly nobody would have released it prior to punk rock, but once the Sex Pistols and Clash had kicked down the doors of the major record corporations, suddenly the experts were no longer that expert on what was going to be a hit. And all kinds of people got through the door behind us, and all kinds of people got through the door behind the Sex Pistols. So there was Elvis Costello in Dury and the Blockheads, Graham Parker and the Rumour, Nick Lowe. All kinds of people managed to get deals, even though they weren't themselves punks. And I think in that febrile atmosphere of punk and post-punk, people were open to ideas of songs that were at least heartfelt, if not expertly sung.
Is it true that originally you were going to write it to the tune of Bob Dylan's Sarah?
I wrote the lyric to Bob Dylan's Sarah, yes. Sometimes when you write songs, it's helpful to have a template that you can work to get the lyric into existence. So if you're starting with a completely blank sheet of paper and you're trying to get a lyric down, particularly if you're seething with anger as I was at the time, it was helpful to just take somebody else's song and write a fresh lyric to it, and then try to see what would fit with it. So yes, it originally went, "The British police are the best in the world. I don't believe one of these stories I've heard." I mean, it fits Sarah perfectly, but then I slept on it, and next morning looked at the words on the sheet of paper and realised that it could just be a swing. So, "British police are the best in the world. I don't believe one."
It's so catchy. What is the secret to writing such a catchy song?
If I knew what the secret to writing a catchy song was, I would have written a great deal more of them. You know, I think all you can do is do the best work you can in the moment you're in, and the rest isn't your business. So I think probably when you're doing something heartfelt, you tap into some other kind of energy. Whereas when you're writing a song to order for EMI Records to be the next single, it's less likely to actually strike a chord with people.
You were one of the first British artists, singers to come out publicly as gay. The rest of the Tom Robinson band, they weren't gay to my knowledge. How did they react to such a song? Were they supportive?
In the first place, I wasn't by any means the first openly gay or queer music artist in the UK. I was just the first one to get into the top 20. That's a moot point, really, because David Bowie had huge success on the basis that he was bisexual, and he did use the word gay as well. And in a way, the fact that he later retracted it and pretended that it had all just been a front didn't really matter, because we had the benefit of that effect socially. So thanks to David Bowie, in the early 70s, for the first time, you could, at school or in the workplace or wherever you happen to be operating, you could say, "I'm gay," or "I'm bi," or "I'm a lesbian," and be one of the good guys, which had never, ever happened in popular culture up to that point. And I said to myself, you know, when Bowie kind of liberated me with this amazing music and this amazing message that you're not alone, I thought, well, if I ever achieve my goal of becoming a musician that people listen to and buy their records, then I'll do my best to try and pass that on in turn. So that's really why I'm so pleased that Glad to Be Gay did as well as it did.
Was the rest of your band, the Tom Robinson band, supportive?
The Tom Robinson band came into existence after the song did. So I was already going out as the Tom Robinson band, just with pickup musicians, just friends helping out on bass, drums, guitar, and what have you. And the band got some momentum going before it had any members. So people who then volunteered to join the actual group knew exactly what they were getting into, and by definition they weren't upset by it, because they were happy to be part of the group.
We talked about problems at the BBC, but Capital Radio in London, it was like the listeners' favourite for 6 weeks. Why do you think it was so popular amongst Capital Radio listeners?
I think in the time of punk, there was a lot of contrary spirit, antic spirit, where people just wanted to sort of make things wild, stir things up a bit. So yes, of course, there were people who wanted sexuality to be a more fluid and easygoing thing than that rigid binary that we'd grown up with. But there were also young people who thought, well, the hell with it, the BBC won't play this, let's just make our feelings felt. Somebody told me they'd been on a bus around that time going through North London, and there was a same-sex couple holding hands on the upper deck of the bus, and the bus conductor came up and tried to throw them off the bus, and spontaneously about half the population of the top floor of the bus started singing Glad to Be Gay and chanting it at the bus conductor. I mean, that's such a brilliant moment to have heard about. especially since, confronted by the entire contents of his bus, the conductor retired and left them alone. So that's great, to hear about.
You never performed it on Top of the Pops, but I think you first performed it on television. Was it on Granada Television? What do you remember about that?
Even before the modestly named Tom Robinson Band actually had a record deal, we got onto Granada's So It Goes, thanks to Tony Wilson, who was later of Factory fame, of course. He presented this show in Granada, and he was interested in having the various happening punk bands of the time come along, and thank God he included TRB as one of those bands. But yeah, that went on the record. And we subsequently did other things. There was a Sight and Sound concert for the BBC. BBC TV didn't have any problem with the song. And subsequently there was also Revolver, which I think came from Central TV in Birmingham. But yeah, it got on telly quite a lot. A surprising amount considering the trouble it had at radio.
You also performed at the Secret Policeman's Ball, I think in 1979, and also at the Gay News Fighting Fund, I think Trafalgar Square, possibly?
Oh, I sang that song so many
So
times.
many times.
In so many different circumstances. And the big advantage of it is that you can just pick up an acoustic guitar and perform it, and it sounds reasonably like itself, even though it was originally recorded with a band. I think, if it had been Bohemian Rhapsody that I'd written with that theme, it would have been considerably more difficult to do at benefits and things.
Any favourite live performances of it?
I think the Secret Policeman's Ball was a particular favourite because at that time Amnesty didn't support queer prisoners. People who were in prison because of their sexuality didn't count as prisoners of conscience or anything that Amnesty wanted anything to do with. So when they invited me to take part in the first ever Secret Policeman's Ball alongside people like Pete Townsend and John Williams and John Cleese, Rowan Atkinson, these amazing people who went on to be phenomenally famous, and some of whom already were. It was a God-given opportunity to sing that song, and the kind of venom with which I sang it at the time was really directed at the directors of Amnesty at the time, saying, wake up, this is something that needs to be addressed.
The song became such an anthem, for instance, at the first Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras Parade in 1978. It was one of the songs that was played on the sound system live from the first truck, along with Meg Christian's Ode to a Gym Teacher. Did you ever realise at the time that it would become such a gay anthem? I
had no idea at the time all this was going on because in the mayhem of trying to pursue a career in music, you're in your own little tour bubble in a tour bus with a load of musicians and surrounded by managers and publishers and roadies and God knows what. So you don't really have your ear out to the wider world. And in those days we didn't have a World Wide Web. It's so easy today to take for granted that information is freely available, which is a miracle. I mean, it is a fantastic miracle of the last 20 years that we have had access to information and been able to spread information and bypass those central gatekeepers of media, such as the BBC. And people hear about stuff now readily. So it's hard to remember and put yourself back in the mindset of what things were like in the 70s. If it hadn't been for gay news in Britain, there would have been no gay community. It was simply because we had this newspaper once a fortnight where you could find out what was happening in other parts of the country, what the latest issues were, what was being done to combat the latest problems. And, of course, the small ad section, so lonely, isolated people could find each other. It was vital. It was our kind of instant internet of the day. And that's why the right-wing Puritan campaigner, Mary Whitehouse, immediately tried to torpedo it, and she used blasphemy laws finally to close down gay news. But by that time the genie was well and truly out of the bottle.
Did publications like Gay News give Glad to be Gay a lot of support?
Necessarily, Gay News reported on Glad to be Gay and the rise of the TRB and the fact that queer songs were getting sung in public places, but you wouldn't have expected otherwise, because even things they didn't agree with, they would still report them. They were a newspaper. But gay news was fantastically important. The editor, Dennis Lemon, was such a pivotal figure to the whole liberation of a whole generation of women and men across Britain at that time, in that period, that we should never forget him, you know. And certainly he supported me early on and encouraged me to just, you know, be myself and do my thing. So yeah, I had no idea really what was going on in Sydney, and it was years later I found out that, you know, there was this whole 78 generation for whom it had been important. So for the 20th anniversary, I think it was, I wrote to Jonathan somebody, who was the director of Mardi Gras at the time, and said, you know, would you like me to come over and do the song for the 20th anniversary? And I got a very snotty letter going back, I don't think so, you know. You're welcome to fly over at your own expense and attend the parade if you want, but we don't want you singing at our bloody parade.
Very dismissive.
So it was very dismissive. I've still got the letter somewhere. Anyway, whoever he was, the hell with him.
Well, it's 40 years next year.
It's 40 years next year. I have to say, nothing would give me greater pleasure than a chance to come and sing Glad to Be Gay in person at Mardi Gras. Mardi Gras, when I attended it in '98, was the single most mind-blowing public spectacle I think I have ever seen anywhere. I'm not just saying that because I'm talking to somebody who knows those people. It really was gobsmacking. I actually took notes at the time of everything I saw, because I could not believe the sheer spectacle of what was passing before my eyes, and the fact that it was passing before my eyes not for 10 minutes, not for 20 minutes, not for half an hour, not for an hour. It was like 2 hours for the whole parade to even go past.
It's got even longer now.
It was unbelievable. I mean, for somebody coming from the backwaters of Britain in the 60s, and then the kind of nascent LGBT scene in London in the 70s, which was pretty small potatoes, then the 1998 Mardi Gras parade was just off the scale for celebration, for inventiveness, for wonderful kind of weirdness, and all the human spirit in all its wide variety of things was there. And then looking at the parade route afterwards, and it was solid tinsel all down the floor, all the way along the parade. It was brilliant.
There's a lot more tinsel now. A couple of more questions. You've changed the lyrics over the years. Where did you get that idea from?
Glad to Be Gay was always a piece of reportage. It was like saying, this is what's going on. At the time in '76, by the time I performed it in '78, already a verse or two had changed, and by the time I did it for The Secret Policeman's Ball in '79, again another verse or two had crept in. So you never wanted a song like that to become a museum piece, where it was just reporting on old injustices, when there were so many bloody new ones on the way. And of course, by the time AIDS came along, you know, there was whole new rafts of reasons why the song was important, why it's important to keep it up to date. And a friend of mine has actually very kindly built a website at gladtobegay.net where he chronicles all the different versions and has managed to track down recordings of them and the lyrics for the different versions as it mutated. So if anybody is honestly that interested, and it's not all that interesting, then you can actually see how it's changed over the years. But of course, you sometimes go back and sing old verses again just to remind yourselves how far you've come. I now do a verse for George Michael, bless him. So the LA police are the best in the world. I don't believe one of these stories I've heard about pretty policemen in leather and jeans showing their leg through a split in the seams. Seeking out superstars, leading them on, then running them in when they start to respond. Back home in Britain, we're equal and free, except when the case is a Tory MP.
The thing about Glad to Be Gay is that it's not just about gay men, it's also about women, it's also about bisexuals, I suppose people who identify as transgender too, intersex. Of course, and we've discussed it in a previous interview, you came out as bisexual. Did the song Glad to Be Gay change your way of thinking? Did you add a verse reflecting that?
The most important thing to say is that in 1976, and up to that point from the Stonewall onwards, from about 69 to the mid-70s, gay, G-A-Y, meant everybody. It was everything non-heterosexual. It was an all-inclusive umbrella term. And I think it's only as that became increasingly associated with gay men that lesbians felt, hold on, you know, you're saying gay, but you actually just mean yourselves. So then lesbian and gay became the way to talk about it. And then, you know, of course, bisexual people said, hold on, let's have a B in there. And, you know, we've been expanding the alphabet ever since. I honestly didn't believe in bisexuality back in the 70s. I thought it was just gay people who hadn't come out properly, or, you know, just a kind of a way of fudging things so it didn't sound quite so bad on your way to properly coming out. When bisexuality actually arrived in my life, it took me very much by surprise, and was massively inconvenient, because by that point I'd already kind of built an entire career on being the guy that sang Glad to be Gay, and then sing If You're Glad to be Bisexual just doesn't scan really. But I did come out, you know, I mean, I talked to Capital Gay in the Pink Paper at the time, once I was living with a woman, and they said, well, you know, why are you telling us this? That's your own affair, quite literally. You know, we all know sexuality is a wide and fluid thing, and it's only when the UK tabloid press got hold of the story that suddenly it became an issue, because they then did all the kind of stars who turned straight stuff and made up loads of quotes, and of course no internet, so you couldn't reply, you couldn't put your own side of things. So that, yeah, things got bad at one stage, and it was very hard to explain that I wasn't in any way renouncing where I'd come from or what I stood for. But at the same time, I think we always stood for people's right to love whoever they like. You know, that's the whole point, is that you can fall in love with anybody, and that human sexuality is like that.
You did mention in a previous interview that you performed, I think, at a Pride concert, and you were booed, but then you went back 10 years later or so and you were cheered. Why do you think the attitude changed within that 10 years, within that decade?
I completely get why people were upset about the papers announcing me having turned straight and embraced heterosexuality and gone back on everything that I stood for. Totally got that, because this was the height of the AIDS crisis, and the stuff that those same tabloid newspapers were writing about us and our community, while our friends were around us were dying horribly in hospitals. You know, I mean, funeral after funeral after funeral. So in that atmosphere, to actually have those same tabloids trumpeting about how one of the people who's been standing tall in the movement has reneged on it and gone back on it and denounced it, even though it was all lies, of course you'd be upset. I would be upset. And I wasn't terribly happy when Lou Reed and David Bowie did it. But at the same time, you know, you've got to understand why that happened. 10 years later, when I went back, I was invited back at the bisexual stage, and they had a separate tent at Pride on Clapham Common, and asked me to come and play, and I turned up and unpacked my guitar and plugged it in and went up to the mic, and got cheered. I thought, whoa, that's all right. And somebody shouted, "Where have you been, Tom?" And I shouted back, "Making babies." And they all cheered. So suddenly it was like a homecoming. It was like, it's all right to, whoever you are, be who you are. And, you know, don't let anybody else tell you how to live your life.
Is there anything else you'd like to add about Glad to be Gay?
The earliest tenet of gay liberation, when I first discovered it in the early 70s, and the people who put a lot of thought into the whole politics of how this was going to work and why it mattered, always said, gay liberation is everyone's liberation. It's not, just in the same way that feminists argue that the patriarchy hurts men every bit as much as it hurts women. I think gay liberation in its oldest sense of gay was always about liberating the wider society as well as yourself. And that's why I think so many people who didn't identify in any way as non-heterosexual found that song powerful and meaningful, you know, bless them, and still like to sing it at gigs. In the same way that I would go to a Public Enemy concert and shout "Fight the Power," or I would have gone to James Brown and even then shouted "Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud." Why not? You're basically standing up with the human spirit to just be yourself and fuck everybody else. And if that message still carries, well, good for him.
Tom Robinson, thank you very much.